Well, we've had a wonderful day of presentations, sort of setting the stage of where we are. We heard from Dr. Keeney about WHO efforts in response to H1N1 and the role that WHO has played. We've had a presentation of the existing efforts to invest in international vaccine capacity building from HHS and WHO and PATH, and we've had a really good discussion, I think, on what's out there in terms of what could be provided for vaccine production in developing countries in terms of the technologies that are there. A fairly good presentation of that. We talked about the regulatory aspects and some of the challenges that we're going to have to deal with respect to regulatory aspects, and finished up with cost considerations, and I think had a very good discussion on that. I'm not sure if we have any particular specific questions from the group. We really didn't sit down to develop a set of questions, but I have some that I will pose after I pass it over to my co-chairs. So.
Well, indeed, I think it was a very interesting session, the whole of today, because it has really put a lot of different elements on the table, the technology, the regulatory, the financial, and of course these are all the aspects which need to be taken into consideration when you do want to embark into building capacity, and mainly of having this capacity sustainable. So I would really like for the discussion that we have now and some points, and Mike may come with some question to really see how we can engage also our colleagues from the industry here and not from the developing country industry. I see Tony there. I don't want to put you on the spot, especially knowing that Norbert has not been able to join you still in the snow, I guess. But really, the industry, the current industry of influenza vaccine has a lot of contribute to that in their knowledge of all these aspects of this production and of the sustainability and also the economical aspects of this production. So I would really want to engage and to continue to advocate that the current manufacturer and the large-scale manufacturer are an entire part of the equation and a partner when we try to build up this capacity in regions and in developing countries.
I'd like just to, when I was a child, my mother would, in the morning, would send me off to school and say, listen to your teachers. And that's what I've done a lot of today. And then when I would come home, she would drill me on, so what did you learn? And I'm not going to be able to capture the full spectrum of the ideas that were presented today. But there were some themes and concepts that I personally do not want to lose track of today, and I would hope that we can work on some of those over the next day and a half, as well as to generate many more of these kinds of ideas. First of all, so the messages I've heard is that what we planned for is not what we got in terms of planning for a pandemic and what we got during the pandemic. That there is a definite geographic maldistribution of resources in terms of manufacturing capacity, and therefore an extension of that is that there is lack of access and availability of vaccines for pandemic purposes and other purposes. That certainly there is progress being made in building capacity in various areas of the world, and those efforts are in various stages of evolution and nearness of completion, because we all started at different points, and can't expect that we would all have the same achievements over the same amount of time, that there is much more work to be done, and importantly, many more partnerships and much more investment that is going to be needed. There's a need for surge capacity for a pandemic, and that's inherent to our discussions of seasonal flu and sustainability, but also that we need to keep this in mind not only for influenza, but other potentially high-impact diseases that may have significant regional, sub-regional impact on human health and on economic health. There's a lot of work going on, as I said, to build capacity, but what we're missing are the scale-up plans. We're still talking about relatively small numbers of additional doses of influenza vaccine per year globally. So there is a significant difference between where we are today than where we are 5 years ago, but it is a quantum leap beyond this point to understand how we could better meet the needs in a severe pandemic. I was also impressed, and you could hear from some of my answers of, we hear a lot in international discussions about donations, about donors, about investment, and we heard today a lot about what it takes on the part of the host governments, that this is a partnership both in terms of capacity building and in terms of the investment, because we have no hopes for sustainability if what we provide or what we grow together with governments, if governments do not make it a priority to continue those activities. I'm struck by not only how many public-private partnerships there are, but the opportunities that there could be for many more public-private partnerships. Many of us come from government organizations or academia. And part of the partnerships that we need to forge, I believe, are with the private sector so that we can use that data to improve public health for the general public. I heard very strongly the need for harmonization of all of the donors and the development partners and the technical agencies in individual host countries. And as much as we all want to help, our lack of harmonization is really helping no one. In fact, is probably harming. Thinking out of the box of flu vaccination, we all use the mantra of seasonal flu, and I'm hearing the out-of-the-box thinking of reduce childhood mortality, reduce healthcare costs, and these may need to be the political words that we need to learn in order to move the agenda forward. And importantly, we also heard about, I was particularly taken by our Thai colleagues in terms of, it is not an overnight phenomenon. It is not an overnight process to get change in policies in governments. It took 5 years. Investing in the people who could do the analysis, who could become trusted public servants to the policymakers. Many of the donors, and with all due respect, the international organizations, can do study after study after study, but it probably has much more emphasis and credibility if it's coming from your own colleagues, your own population of experts. And that it's important to have a stepwise progression. Do not go from A to Z as your plan, but steps in between that will lead you to continuous progression. And as I sense that there is still more work to be done and more milestones to be met. That relates to priorities. We heard a lot of great ideas. We need to do more on regulatory. We need to do new technologies. We need to build factories. We need to have new tests. We need new standardization. But as one of the co-chairs, I'd like to say that over the next day and a half, we also need to hear from you, the experts in the field. What should be the priorities? We can't do everything at once. But what are the necessary first steps in the short term, medium term, and long term? Because otherwise, I'm already feeling overwhelmed. And so it's going to be hard to convince those who hold the purse strings if we take the whole package and cannot explain a natural progression of our investments to build a foundation, demonstrate success, and to move forward. Overall, in terms of process, I warned you at the beginning of the day that we'd be talking at you a lot today. And with all due respect to all the speakers, I felt they were very, very good and informative presentations. The format for the next day and a half will be less and less and less and less presentations. And we really encourage you to not only ask questions, but offer suggestions and ideas, more out-of-the-box ideas, more ideas of priorities. What have we not thought of? And tomorrow's theme are what are the needs and what are the gaps? And I think many of us are very good at identifying what's wrong with a situation. It's going to be much more difficult to identify how we can fix it in ways that are realistic in terms of resources and in ways that are innovative. So I think my mother would be proud that I did learn something today, and I'm looking forward to listening to my teachers tomorrow.
That's very hard to top. You've really covered things in an extraordinarily thoughtful and broad way. I would perhaps just emphasize three reflections that I had on this day. I came into this meeting believing it was crazy to push a 50-year-old vaccine technology on the world. And I leave with exactly the same feeling, but a better understanding of why the intermediate and incremental approaches are almost certainly more important than doing something completely out of the box. But it does say there really needs to be accelerated research on subunit vaccines and recombinant vaccines for two reasons. One is they're cheap, and if they're effective with things like adjuvants, ironically enough, it'll be other countries that enable the United States to move with new technologies, given the mindset of the public and the caution within the government. So I think that's an example of the kind of reciprocity. It would be interesting to know, I was recently in India, 1/3 of all pills taken in the world have some component manufactured in India. So the second issue that I would challenge my colleagues in government to think about is, at a time of economic crunch, how do we justify spending money on scientific or other overseas development assistance to developing countries? And I think that the first thing is to see what the rewards are of pills and vaccines protecting people all over the world, which ultimately protects citizens everywhere. And at the same time, providing us with vaccines and materials that our own industry has not wanted to make. So that these are contributions done in the best of, I think, altruistic virtue, but also have real practical import for all the people, not just in developing countries, but here. The second thought is tremendously rewarding to hear words, particularly from people in governments, about multilateralism. That's not a word we heard a lot of for many years in Washington. Realizing that nobody and no country can do it all, and help reduce the disparities in a significant way between rich and poor countries. But the rules of collaboration are not clear. And at least in my jaded experience, when agencies contribute or countries contribute, the issue of attribution becomes a problem. Who gets credit for wiping out smallpox? Who gets credit for vaccinating the last kid with polio? And I would hope that leaders in government and science could say that's one of the least important and interesting questions in the world. The question is, what have we accomplished together beyond what we could do individually? And that leads to the third reflection on the day, which is I was so impressed with the answer to the question that Daniel asked Dr. Vichai. How did you sell it to policymakers? And think of his answer. We spent 5 years doing our homework. We spent 5 years collecting the best data, making the best case, analyzing the data. And it took 1 day with the Prime Minister to change the policy. So what it says is that I think we have to do a better job of just what they did in Thailand, collecting the data, making the case, and presenting it not just to the policymakers, but in a democracy, presumably the people are the policymakers. And the people here in this country and in parts of Europe, certainly, and as we heard in some developing countries, have the wrong message about vaccines. And we have a really important job of information and communication on the basis of those analyses. So with that, I thought it was an enormously rich day, and I learned a lot too.
Yeah. So I had a couple of questions. One actually is to the group before we open it up for any outside discussion. But my question is: Did we cover everything today in setting the stage? Did we leave anything out that we should have put in terms of telling you where we are in this venture? Nobody has a burning? Yeah? So.
Joan Blair, Center for Biologics, USFDA. I noticed there's really nothing about adverse event surveillance. Mm-hmm. I mean, not a focus piece, and I think that's an important piece that perhaps is a gap.
Yeah, I think it would be interesting to add explanation of what does the H1N1 experience that we have gone through the last 7 months or so done to the way we approach this big issue. I don't think we have really talked about it, but it's something that is pretty necessary, I think.
Okay, and I think some of these will come up tomorrow in terms of gaps as well. So, and then the other point I just wanted to make was already made. Actually, a lot of the good points have been made, but I wanted to go back to the industry situation and the question that Mary Paul raised. In particular, Dr. Elliott's description of the tech transfer activities that was undertaken by a very large company. And couple that with Dr. Bloom's presentation of the advanced market commitments. And I guess the question is a simple one. The advanced market commitments where we would say that we would, commit to pay for the top price for a vaccine early on with the idea that the price would go down later on. Is that a better paradigm, or would a better paradigm be to look at engaging industry and essentially paying for tech transfer, since it's such a monumental sort of hill that we're climbing in terms of truly getting global technology transfer to developing countries. We purposely did not bring in industry because of the fact that there's 30 some odd companies that are making influenza vaccines, and it would have been very difficult to be equitable and have industry represented here. And frankly, they weren't that happy. We got some not so nice emails, but we decided we wanted to do this in a nonprofit sort of approach. But I guess that's a question to think about tomorrow from my perspective is, have we engaged industry to the full degree that we can?
comment on the technologies and also on advanced commitment and the high price of vaccine. The flu vaccines are really something which is specific for flu in the sense that the technology is a global public good, if I may say. It belongs nobody. It's been done for decades. Anybody can do it with, the proper equipment, the proper funding. If you don't want to do anything really sophisticated, so it's not a question. The question of the flu vaccine and the cost of a normal flu vaccine, I don't think is the main issue to scale up of deployment of influenza vaccine. It's much more the logistics and the deployment costs which are a barrier. The fact that you need to revaccinate every year, which are really a hurdle to flu vaccination. So it's very different if you compare to if, an example would be HPV vaccine, which are tremendously expensive, when you can think also that some of advanced commitment or something would accelerate introduction into developing countries. But this is, at least for flu, this is as well an advantage and also a hurdle in the introduction in developing countries of new technologies, if you wish, because the technology that we have right now belongs nobody. Anybody can use it. If you are talking about introducing the new technology, we will have to be careful of what is the cost of this technology, because we are all aware, I think, that the cost of vaccine has nothing to do with the price of product. Well, the price of vaccine has nothing to do with the cost of goods. So therefore, it is not because we do think when we do the calculation, the math, that a vaccine made in E. coli would be much less expensive, but actually it would be. And that access to technology is easy. So there's always, a question. I agree with you that there should be a push to help introduce these newer generation vaccines, but there are also hurdles on the way.
I think what we'd like to do is, the theme for today was sort of where we are, what's the status, and we'd like to invite you to pardon me just a minute, my son is calling. We'd like to invite you to, from your experience, if you haven't been up to the podium today, if you want to provide some of your perspectives from your experience of your understanding of the status, to amplify, to augment, or to take us in a different direction, we have time for discussion, and that's what we hope to have, is for you to identify areas that we need to do some more thinking about. I did see a question back here. Please, Mr. Razli.
Razli Muhammad Nurdin from the Organization Islamic Conference. I thank you for the invitation from the Department of Health and Services, Human Services of US to participate in this workshop. But after listening the whole day today about the technology, about the gaps, about the supply, in particularly that in every talk there was a talk about transfer of technology to developing countries. But here what we have is only industry from developing countries. But where are the developing countries? How do we know that they need the technology? Yes, the industry need the technology. So I wonder whether WHO or myself here are representing developing countries. No. We need the developing countries to say that, look, they need the technology. It's not the industry that need the technology. Who will buy the product? Do they have investment? Or do this is a high priority for them? So thank you very much.
Yes.
Thank you very much for this question. I must say that in the first 6 list of developing country vaccine manufacturers who received assistance to establish their technology, all except one, Serum Institute of India, are governmental organizations. And for each, before we decided to award these grants, we requested also evidence that this was supported by their government. So we are aware of the fact that, it's not only because a manufacturer wants to have a technology that this can be sustainable in a country. And as you say, indeed, it is very important to have from the very beginning a commitment by the government sustain and to have this a national on the national plan, if I may say. Tony.
Tony Colgate, IFPMA and Novartis Vaccines. I'd like to give just a kind of a general view on today. As a basic production man, I've been making flu vaccines for 42 years, on and off. I think Robin Robinson gave a very good perspective of where we are, kind of at least recognizing the old technology. Now, you're calling it old technology, but it has moved a hell of a lot in the last 40 years. I don't know if any of you are old enough to have had a vaccine 40 years ago, but you wouldn't like it. Today, the vaccines are virtually pain-free. I accept the adjuvanted ones are a little more painful, but the benefit is there for the pain. But I agree, the technology hasn't altered an awful lot, but the GMP and the conditions under which those vaccines are made has improved considerably. And the vaccines made today are, I would say, 90% better than those made 40 years ago. Moving on, I was very impressed on the progress that's been made since we last met at Serum Institute in India, which I think was only in 2008, towards the end of 2008, and certainly the Serum Institute has really made big steps forward. But I'm not surprised, because they have the technology, they have the know-how, and we were all very impressed with their facilities. I have one cause for complaint there was their inactivated vaccine, the virus that they're using, giving credit to LIBSC. That virus, X197A, didn't come from LIBSC, it came from Doris Booker at New York Medical College here in the US. And I think without Doris, we wouldn't have had a vaccine, because basically most of her viruses, her reassortants, have been used to produce the vaccines that we've all made for H1N1, and I think she should really get some recognition from that. The other point I think is interesting. You all kind of skipped over it. You've said, of course, we didn't make as many vaccines as we wanted to, because it didn't grow very well. Now, isn't that where we should be concentrating? And basically, that's what we have been doing with our group of companies in IFPMA. We've been trying, for seasonal vaccines in particular, to improve the number of virus isolates that are available to us by sponsoring collaborating centres to produce more egg isolates. We've also been sponsoring Doris Booker at New York Medical College, and IBSC and CSL does it on their own to produce as many reassortants as they can. Now, all of this is really designed to help and to get more viruses available for vaccine manufacture. The bigger selection we have, the better chance we have of finding one that grows well. In addition, IFPMA is also sponsoring, and it was interesting, this came up again for something that's going to happen in the future. Well, it's already happening. We're within IFPMA sponsoring with CDC a collaborative study for isolation in qualified cell lines rather than eggs. And hopefully sometime in this year or next year we will have data to prove that you can actually isolate in qualified cell lines and possibly from the qualified cell lines you could then produce produce a working seed in eggs, so that you can do away with the egg isolation altogether. Now, the only way, as the Thais have found out, you can do this kind of thing and convince agencies that this is possible and should be done is to produce data. And that's basically what we're doing. We're trying to produce information and give a solid basis for this potential change. And that, as we saw in the presentation, should give us more virus isolates and possibly better matched isolates for the future. With that, I think that's about all I have for the moment. There is one other thing, but I'm hoping that Norbert will be here tomorrow, and it's the main part of his presentation, so I will leave it for him.
Thank you.
I just have one request. Are we going to get copies from the presentations of today?
We're just discussing that administratively. We have some bureaucratic issues to deal with in terms of being able to post them on a website. But if you would like to request certain presentations or a group of presentations, we will give you an email address to submit those requests to. And then, to be frank, we haven't done all of our homework. To release those, we have to have approval by the presenters, et cetera, et cetera. So we have a few check boxes left to do in that regard. Actually what I'll do is I will give you an email address right now, and it is drama. hhs.international@hhs.gov. G-O-V. That is our email address for whether we've been using for centralized receiving of requests for information from H1N1, etc. So it's a joint email that we share between ASPR and OGHA. So we'll be able to, as soon as we check all the boxes, we'll attempt to accommodate your requests. But ideally, we would like to move towards a solution in which you could have easy access to whatever of the presentations you saw. Was that sufficiently diplomatic? Joan?
One, on your slide issue, you could consider WHO posting them, and then that would resolve you of that bureaucratic problem. Are you talking about 508 compliant? Is that your problem?
Thank you. That's an excellent idea, which we will pursue aggressively.
Okay, but that's not really wasn't my point. An alternative perspective that you might want to consider in terms of, I think we all heard that in fact facilitating the expansion of vaccine production capacity is a longer or midterm to longer term challenge, but another pandemic could hit at any moment. A complementary strategy should perhaps be contemplated, which would be coming up with a strategy for the surge of existing manufacturers. Perhaps a financing tool or whatever, but an interim strategy, an acute strategy, push, pull, whatever, for the existing manufacturers to expand their production, just as BARDA does now for the U.S., but something more global in nature.
So one thing I know is that there are several folks here who are on the Global Health Security Initiative group, like Dr. Salisbury and Dr. Shiro. And I think Mary Julio's here, so we're represented by these guys as well. And I know some of them have opinions about this because I've talked to them, namely Dr. Salisbury. So I wonder if you had any comments or thoughts on our approach. Not to put you on the spot or anything.
I'm not sure what not to put you on the spot means in this context. It's been very helpful to listen to the ebb and flow of the presentations and having to look at where we are against where we might want to have been right now. And it's too early, I think, to be doing lessons learned. But we are all going to have to look at lessons learned both in our own national roles and indeed in our international roles, because so many of us here have responsibilities outside of our domestic work. And the issue is that we're chasing a virus that is infecting people faster than we can keep up with it. And by that I mean we can't produce vaccine fast enough to keep up with the natural infection that is running ahead the whole time. And that is what we have to find a solution to. We have to find a solution that allows a matching of supply and demand between, and that relationship, which is both a push and a pull. And so if you create capacity, it's no good unless you've got demand, because capacity for which there is no purchaser or no user is not going to be sustainable. And if we create demand and we don't have capacity to fulfill it, again, we find ourselves in a situation of some frustration. But by creating capacity, we have to have sufficient capacity to produce large quantities in a very short period of time. And that doesn't really fit with the model that is built on seasonal flu vaccine production as currently utilized. So we really have some huge imponderables. And I think it comes back to what Barry was saying as well, and that is that 50-year-old technology will never solve this conundrum. It can't. We can't put in sufficient capacity to be able to produce enough vaccine for the world ahead of the virus infecting people with what we've got. There are things that we can do to make the current circumstances better, but they won't ever solve the problem. And solving the problem will only come by that quantum step that takes us away from the 50-year-old technology to something that deals with how do we get sufficient production at a cost-effective price quickly enough to be ahead of a virus that is very good at jumping from person to person. So I don't think I've helped this debate at all, because I don't think that as yet we have a solution to it. The more we can do to understand some of the constraints within our present circumstances, the better we'll be able to do something about improving it. But we won't actually solve it with what we've got. Thank you.
Abdullah Brooks from ICD-DRB / Johns Hopkins. I just want to underscore the comment made about one of the gap areas. I think it was Joan or someone who mentioned this about serious adverse events reporting. And I think, we run the risk of underestimating the importance of this for developing countries which currently don't even have some of the vaccines that we're talking about, especially the influenza vaccine. And a couple of years ago, Steve Black and others arranged a discussion in Annecy, France, to discuss sort of a global network of, like the VAERS, but sort of expanding that same model on a larger scale. And what I recall from that discussion was just the absence of systems in many of these countries. And the point being raised that some of these vaccines not only are going to be introduced in developing countries, but may be introduced in developing countries directly without having been tested in other countries that do have these post-introduction surveillance systems. And so in the spirit of, when one designs a clinical trial, one builds in the monitoring and evaluation system as a design feature of the study itself. I think, as we go forward with this, I think one of the things we really want to give some thought to is the structural or the infrastructure of how will the effects be monitored, and what sort of struck that, at least for me, an important note was the discussion earlier today about just some of the misinformation about vaccines that already is there. And if we think this can happen as it has in educated, industrialized countries, well, it certainly can happen in developing countries as these things go forward. We're going to have some of the same questions and concerns. And I can see years of painstaking work to set up a vaccine program being undermined in a matter of days by a very determined minority who can engage in misinformation. I think the bulwark against that is having good surveillance going forward, not just on morbidity and mortality and impact of the vaccine, but on serious adverse events so that we can have these data available for everyone. So just something that we might want to think about, and how would that be done? How would it be funded? How would it be coordinated? Should WHO take the lead on that? But it should be something which is where there are common standards, that we can compare data across countries, across regions, and be able to speak with authority about the impact of the vaccine or these serious adverse events.
Dr. Wood. David Wood from WHO. To answer directly to that point, indeed, yes, we do actually have a new project which started just in December of last year with funding from the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation to actually take forward the project that you mentioned that Steve Black initiated a couple of years ago to look at developing a blueprint for global vaccine safety evaluation. So this is a one-year project in the first instance to look at the landscape and to see what exactly can be done to bring stakeholders to the table to develop plans to strengthen adverse events monitoring for exactly the type of reasons that you mentioned. So that's one piece of news that actually is going ahead. In addition to that, though, we have already been working, and we have other projects underway at the WHO level to strengthen adverse events monitoring for vaccines that are being used in the countries that particularly receiving their vaccines through UN supply. So the vaccines that have been pre-qualified by WHO. So, for example, we have a network of sentinel countries that have been established that have already some post-marketing surveillance capacity, and we are going into those countries. We have done already country analysis to look at the actual systems in place, working with them to strengthen their systems to a common standard, and to use the experience in those countries when they introduce newly pre-qualified vaccines to get as rapidly as we can in a standardized way information about the adverse events profile. And then the third thing we do is we always provide technical advice to countries when they face problems around safety signals or safety problems with vaccines. We know that this is a highly important event in many countries if there are adverse events, the majority of which are often programmatic errors when you're working with programmatic programs that are less well-resourced than in the developed world. So in many instances, it regrettably turns out to be a programmatic error that has resulted in the adverse event, but nevertheless, they can still derail the immunization programs, and so it's very important to provide a strong technical support to those countries is to help them work through whatever has gone on in the country so that they can provide an explanation to the populace, which is what is needed. So you're absolutely right. This is a crucial area. It needs a lot of attention. It needs more work and attention than we have already been able to put into place. But I think that there's quite a lot that's there as a base, and we need to sort of build on that for the future.
If I could address a follow-up to that in terms of identifying these very issues are very important part of this workshop. We envision that, as I said earlier, this is just the beginning of the conversation. As I said, I was feeling a little overwhelmed by all the work that needs to be done, but I think for the future there are bits and pieces that we can pull off that the technical experts can get together and identify the technical needs and identify what would be needed to satisfy some of those needs. And that segues into my next comment, because I'm now going to put on my government hat, part of the organization that is responsible for implementing government donations or decisions about funding for building capacity and provision of goods and products and technical assistance. Is, I think, for a policymaker, it has been very difficult to describe or even explain what an investment is going to give you as a return. Not necessarily in terms of cost effectiveness, but what part of, are you buying bricks and mortar? Are you buying the first pilot lot? What's the milestone that you can, unfortunately, many of the policymakers, or I shouldn't say unfortunately, I will just make it a fact. Many policymakers in our parliaments, in our Congress, in our et cetera, are not technical experts. And so it is not realistic to expect that we can use technical terminology to explain what those investments are actually doing. So I think that we really need, in terms of thinking out of the box, is a way to compartmentalize or to identify, using a metaphor, if we're going to build a foundation, which brick are they buying? Or are they buying the bricks? Or are they buying the wood? Or are they buying the chimney? Or because they just don't get a sense of what they're getting in return. It's hard to. We spoke earlier of attribution. It's hard to with the many donors and the contributions of host governments. It's very difficult to go to a policymaker and attribute your dollar or the reduction in mortality to their dollars. But I think we need to be able to explain better a stepwise approach of this is what comes first, this is what comes next, because many times we just present everything and we don't get there very quickly in terms of the end product. And that's difficult from a perspective of trying to convince policymakers and decision makers that these are worthwhile investments for public goods, for example. To address the question of is there some way we can get around having to immunize against influenza on an annual basis, I think that's real. Where I would encourage you to speak with some of the people from HHS BARDA. That is some of the advanced development work that is going on in terms of the next generation of technologies to have a vaccine. The ideal is a universal vaccine, that you get immunized once and you never have to be immunized against influenza again. But, that's still fantasy at this point. But once again, what are the incremental steps that can get us away from the challenges of annual vaccination? And there are many experts in the room who could speak more accurately about what is being done to do that.
just to comment on the duration. My guess is the vaccines do endure quite a bit longer than 1 year. It's the virus that changes every year, and hence having a long-lasting vaccine against a virus that's not about to do you in is good for the vaccine, but not very good for the recipient.
That's the challenge: is that we have an opposition that has the ability to mutate and to change, so that we cannot either detect it on the radar, and to use the metaphor, the weapons we have can be less effective or not effective at all. That's the definition of a pandemic: a novel virus that emerges for which the human population has no immunity. On behalf of my co-chairs, I'd like to thank you for coming for today's session. The welcome reception is across the hallway, and we will be starting again tomorrow at... I don't have my glasses.
8:30.
8:30 in this room. Thank you all.